This is Regained Wellness Podcast with Jamie Logie, episode 143, The Myth of Moderation. Hey guys, what's happening? Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Jamie Logie. I run regainedwellness.com, and this is Regained Wellness Podcast with the NBA Jam intro. Hopefully you remember that if you played it. And this is an episode that's it's something I've just sort of, I don't want to say stumbled across, but this whole idea of moderation and if our approach to moderation is actually way off. And it's something I've been aware of, and it's something, it's sort of a standard fitness, health, whatever line where people are just like, yeah, everything in moderation is fine, but is it really? I don't know. And I've had a different approach that you might be interested in, and sort of based on, stuff I've read and some other much smarter people's interpretations of it that, you might want to consider. So it's a combination of looking at things from the standpoint of what moderation really is, and how do we even know for yourself if you're eating things in moderation, using air quotes here. So whether it's, like whatever, snacks or cookies or like whatever type thing that is what you put into the mix for moderation. And I consider myself in this too. Like, I'm speaking to myself as well. But whatever, like the things that we consider that we're having in moderation, we might not actually be doing that. We might, say with two different people, I'm having a certain amount of whatever, like 5 cookies, and the other person's having 3. In relation, I'm not moderating the food as much as that person. And how do we know what's too much for us or whatever? So it's sort of a different approach to this whole statement and sort of philosophy of everything in moderation. So I'll try and break this down for you as best I can. Okay, here we go. So there's an interesting article that a guy named Jeff Novick, a registered dietitian, wrote like almost 10 years ago. And it just sort of popped up because the guy sort of sums up everything in this whole moderation and do kind of that idea of, do all foods really fit? And something now that I think, maybe they don't all actually fit, but they can fit when we take the right approach to our diet, and when we actually look at what we're consuming and and just as importantly, not consuming. So when we're looking back here, whether it's, like I said, like snacks or desserts or wine or whatever, nothing, the idea is nothing is bad in and of itself as long as we just don't consume too much of it. And that's always been the approach, that these things aren't inherently bad. It's just the way we maybe overdo it. But again, like I mentioned just before, how do we define too much, and how do we know if we have surpassed that? So that's the big issue. And it kind of goes back, like this guy Jeff makes some interesting points, that the idea of everything in moderation goes way back actually to almost ancient Greece. And there is the temple of Apollo at Delphi, and there was an inscription there that said "Meden agan," or nothing in excess. And so from this, over the millennia and centuries, we got the concept of doing something in moderation, which means don't do it excessively. Basically, therefore, someone who moderates their food consumption may choose to eat from all the food groups, but will limit their intake of those foods that may cause, negative effects on the body. They might eat the amount that is harmless, but there's just sort of this whole idea of, balance it out. So how are you and we doing in this area now? So the problem is, if you look back then, they didn't have any artificial ingredients or trans fats or high fructose corn syrup or aspartame or artificial sweeteners or anything like that. So when they talk about, still enjoying those things that they consider, you know, basically treats or something that they would want to, you know, have in moderation. They didn't have any of the junk or crap we have today. So, the stuff they would have consuming, even their idea of bad food would be what we'd consider probably superfoods today. Just there was no chemicals. There was nothing that could overly cause them harm. Whereas now we're obviously bombarded with, you know, fake foods, like facsimile foods. They have the appearance of food, they have the taste of food, but they're really not foods from any, you know, packaged, manufactured, process based, whatever, to straight up junk food, to everything like that. We know the overwhelming amount of these detrimental additives and compounds that are causing our problems. So it's interesting to look from way back then, and they had this idea of moderation when they were eating essentially, you know, clean as a whistle. The big things that we know that are causing harm to your diet and that are widely reported, we're very well of the excess consumption of obviously added sugars, refined grains and flours, too much sodium, fat, you know, too much of the bad types of fat. And again, like I mentioned, like the trans fats and the hydrogenated oils and all that stuff. So going off some stats from a few years ago, and, you know, more than likely these things always elevate. They never tend to stay the same. At the moment, well, as of a few years ago, the average person is, when it comes to added sugars, is eating 242% over the recommended upper limit. And if you actually look at some of these recommended upper limits, they're probably way too high to start with. You know, they are old kind of food pyramids and food guides had, you know, really been based on a lot of bad science and sometimes having the interest of large food groups more than they do your health. So those, I mean, these are starting to change now. And like, I live in Canada, and they're starting to have a different approach to what should be recommended and what, you know, like the food pyramid idea has been turned around a bit. And so there's progress happening in that. And I think that's a good thing. But for decades, what has been recommended, we're probably already at the, you know, higher limits of what they should be anyway. But then we're going way overboard with it too. So like I said, added sugars, 242% over the recommended upper limit. Refined grains, 200% over the recommended upper limit. Sodium, 229% over. Saturated fats, 158% over the recommended upper limit. And solid fats, 281% over the limit. And I'd say these are going to change a bit. I'd say the sugar's down a bit, and I assume it's going to keep going down. I think people are more aware of the harms that sugar can cause, whether it's just, you know, straight up weight gain problems to diabetes to, you know, links with heart disease and everything like that. And there's more information out there, and whether it's, you know, documentaries or news reports or whatever, I think people have always been aware, but I think they're really aware now how this could almost be classified as a drug in how harmful it is to your body. And with the fat issue, we're now, I'm assuming, like, if you're listening to this episode, you have some interest in health, and I imagine you're aware of trans fats, and they're probably something you should stay away from. And I've done episodes on specifically trans fats. So I'll link a couple of the shows that are related with these additives that we eat too much of that I think you find interesting. So if you go to the show notes today, which is sort of the after show, if you will, so it's on my website, and it's where I link all the stuff up that I talk about in the show. So today, if you go to regainedwellness.com/143 on the interwebs, you will find some links, and I'll put up a show more about the dangers of trans fats, an episode just about sugar. I mean, that can be just an entire podcast, you know, a weekly podcast dedicated to the problems with sugar. But hopefully I summed it up pretty good in a 45-minute episode. So listen to those. So I'd say, like, the consumption of trans fats is definitely going down, and it's to the point where it's almost an illegal ingredient as far as what it does to our bodies. And it basically turns into sludge in your arteries. And the quick thing, if you're not sure what trans fat is, it's where you take sort of like a liquid, like a fat that would be sort of liquid at room temperature, and you add in hydrogen atoms, which they call hydrogenation, and it basically now makes it more solid at room temperature. So it's more usable for, I don't know, like baking, and it gives sort of like a mouthfeel to stuff when they take out, say, sugar or whatever, and they can add in the trans fats. And honestly, probably the main reason they use it is it's almost like a preservative, and it is very cheap to make, and it can extend the shelf life of products like almost indefinitely, just because it like acts like this preservative. So that's probably the main reason it's used, and one of those things that no one really seemed to look at how dangerous this might be for people to eat. Now they are, though. So our consumption of things like that, I think, will change and is changing a bit, but it's still with the, I mean, we're still consuming a lot of sugar and refined grains, and sodium is through the top. You know, we're over consuming the stuff we know to stay away from. So these 5 items tend to, like that I just mentioned, like the sugars, the grains, sodium, saturated fats, solid fats, these are things we can no longer really consume in moderation because we eat them all the time. And like the current level of consumption is far, way beyond the level we know to cause harm. You know, I was saying before, even the recommended limits may potentially not be good for us. And that's the recommended limits, which are so low. You know, you're not eating 2 chips at a time or half an Oreo. You know, we're eating way more than these things. So again, like I include myself in this, and those things that we consider to be moderation are almost like our staple foods. And that's pretty alarming. And we know they cause harm. So the only, you know, the real solution is, you know, the dramatic reduction in the amounts we consume of these items. Then you can look into having them again in moderation. But when we're eating so much over the top, you can't really say it's moderation because it's just like a daily occurrence. And the other problem, like when you start, say you have whatever your go-to snack of choice is, and you start eating that every day thinking it's in moderation, over time, you sort of get accustomed to it, and you think you're at a low level, and then you think it's okay to have a bit more and more, and slowly these things grow to the point like what used to be moderation is exceeded, and then now that becomes the new moderation, and sort of that's the danger over the long term. So that's the first thing is you know, dramatically reducing the intake of those things, and then maybe, you know, you can add them back in here or there. But there's sort of like that flip side to saying everything in moderation. There are the things we know that are very beneficial that we should be consuming, you know, probably quite a bit of in order to gain their benefit. And that's going to be obviously things like vegetables, fruits, good whole grains is sort of a tough thing to say, but more natural based grains, like things like, you know, quinoa or brown or wild rice, or, you know, flax seeds or chia seeds, stuff like that. You know, there's a problem with things like, I don't know, like breads and whatever getting sort of lumped into the whole grains thing, when that's really not correct. When you look at something like a bread, and it could be, you know, 7 grain whole bread, which it sounds like it might be all right, but it's still, you're not actually eating grains. You're eating refined, ground, pulverized flour that is super absorbable in your body. It's like a fast acting carb. Same thing with like pasta and stuff like that. It might be made from whole wheat, but it's, again, you're eating flour. So not very many people are actually eating whole grains unless you're, you know, eating oats and like the flax seeds and the chia seeds and stuff like that, hemp seeds and whatever, and real grains. And then fiber is probably one of the biggest things that people are missing out on. The average person may be getting 3 to 5 grams a day, when you're wanting, for men, upwards of 35 plus, women 25-ish, around there. And it's just because generally we're not eating a lot of fresh stuff, and that's ideally where you're going to find fiber. So with the stats we're looking at about how much we're overeating on those certain things, here's what on average, you know, again from a few years ago, what we're eating of, with based on the recommended minimum intake of those things like the fruits and vegetables. So fruits, only 42% of the recommended minimum intake we're eating of fruits. Vegetables, only 59% of the recommended minimum intake. Whole grains, and again, that's sort of a wide spectrum, and that's a bit messy, but only 15% of the recommended minimum intake. And fiber, only 40% of the recommended minimum intake. Out of those four, the two that I think you should always be having every day are going to be the vegetables, specifically, dark green leafy vegetables, things like that, and then fiber. Like I said, most people are not getting enough fiber, and fiber is more than just keeping you regular, which is what we associate it with, but it's so important for things like lowering cholesterol, and they're filled with things like pectins, and if you think of like anything that's sort of like, say, like oats or chia seeds, that when they get wet they secrete a gel. That stuff can bind a lot of toxins and stuff to it and help and then eliminate them. They're good for keeping blood sugar under control. They're slowly digested, so good if you have blood sugar issues or stuff like that. Good for gut health. We need that fiber, not just for the digestion, but the health of your microbiome and stuff like that. And then there's different sort of categories: soluble fiber, non-soluble fiber, and then you have things like starches that they call resistant starch, which basically can pass through more, and it's very important for gut health. And you get it in things like, plantains or Jerusalem artichoke or sort of green bananas. It's a specific type of starch that if you're needing, if you're having those digestion issues and having, issues as far as maybe gas or bloating or cramping or skin problems or stuff, it can be related to the health of your gut bacteria. And getting these various forms of fiber and these resistant starches and stuff like that are really helpful in feeding this good gut bacteria. And when your gut is healthy, when you have a better balance of good gut bacteria, that is improving overall health. When it's out of whack, when there's too much bad gut bacteria, it's essentially bugs, little tiny bugs in your stomach. When it's out of whack, when there's too many bad ones, this can actually control your cravings, because they sort of feed off sugars and stuff like that. And a lot of your cravings and what you're wanting is almost dictated by your gut. It's considered to be your second brain in your body because of how much it's involved with chemicals that are used in the brain. And you've heard of neurotransmitters and serotonin and endorphins, all those sort of things. 2/3 of the neurotransmitters in your body are made by your gut. And when I say gut, it's your small intestine, where all the digestion and stuff happens, and that's where your microbiome resides. And if it's not healthy, your immune system can falter because of that. Your obviously like digestion and things like that, but like your mood can be affected. It can lead to autoimmune diseases, and then like joint problems and osteoarthritis and a whole mess of things. And basically inflammation can be happening in your body when your gut bacteria is not too balanced. So we always want to keep it on the positive side. There'll always be some bad gut bacteria, but we want to keep it more on the positive, good gut bugs. And we get that by beneficial fibers and eating those things, really, like the dark leafy greens and, good steel cut oats or sweet potatoes or chia seeds. And like I mentioned, the Jerusalem artichoke and the plantains and all those things. And then along with, if you can get some good probiotic foods, like kombucha or kefir, kimchi, sauerkraut, pickled vegetables, things like that, that's really going to flip the switch to getting that that positive influx of that good gut bacteria, and then that really can help your overall health. So fiber is just such a big thing that most people aren't getting enough of. And sorry, that's a little side rant on fiber, but those big four, the vegetables and the fiber, we really need to focus on. So these things now, when we're talking about moderation, these are actually the things we're eating in moderation. You know, we've gone the other way around. We've made the refined stuff and the crap the staples of our diet, and we're eating, oh, like you'll have a small salad once a week, and that's like your moderation thing, when it should be the reverse situation. And we can basically no longer consume them in moderation, as the current level that we're taking in is so far below what we need to be healthy. So it's a simple solution. It's, you know, have a dramatic increase in the amounts of these things to consume them, with the fruits and vegetables, some of those good, you know, grains, the fiber. Then maybe you can, you know, when you start having those other things in moderation, they're not going to hit you as bad. And what a lot of people find, when you go back to healthy eating and, you know, real whole foods, when you go back to something like junk or whatever, you might find yourself not even liking it anymore. It's artificial food. You can sort of reset your taste buds when you start eating fresh again. And when you go back to something that's not made with real ingredients, a lot of times you just don't desire it anymore, because you've understood what real flavor is and what real nutrition is, and you don't get those in some packaged crap. It's interesting, in this article, it's actually more of a report this guy put together with all this info that comes from the USDA and our overconsumption of calories over the years. And as we've switched into more of a dependence on those, you know, like I said, the refined sugars and grains and stuff. And it's interesting, the last time as a society things were considered to be weight stable, like as a people we were weight stable, was kind of in the early 70s. And, you know, when you look back at pictures, besides the hideous, you know, floral patterns and bell bottoms and corduroy of whatever, everyone appears pretty thin. And it's because our overall caloric intake was down. On average, the average person was having around 2,000 calories a day. They weren't getting, you know, they weren't consuming a lot of artificial sweeteners or fake trans fats, things that really weren't on the scene yet. There's more of an explosion of fast food and junk food in the late 70s and then going into the 80s. And it's only correlated. It's not a direct causation, but when you see the 80s hit, the late 70s actually, and then at the 80s with this, you know, hyper availability of all this junk, that's when you see the obesity rates go up. And you know, obviously they're connected in some ways, but so that's kind of considered the last time as a society people were more weight stable. Into the 90s, the average daily caloric intake was around 2,400. We started eating more flour and cereal products. We were still eating the same amount of things like meat, eggs, and nuts and stuff like that. Again, we're starting to eat more sweeteners and refined sugars. It's starting to go up. The trans fats and the added oils, it's starting to go up. Dairy's going up. Vegetables stay around the same. Fruits are actually going up a little bit, but we're adding in more and more of these refined things. And then going into around, say, 2010, we're consuming almost 2,700 calories a day on average. The flour and the cereal products is way up. The sweeteners, like the sugars and stuff, are about the same, which kind of makes sense because people would have been eating that way for quite a while and would have sort of gotten into a routine. The oils and the stuff go way up at that point. The meat, eggs, nuts, things like that go up a little bit. Vegetables start to go down. Fruits stay about the same. Dairy stays about the same going into that. So I think in the next 10 years, I mean, depending on how the information is shared and people's, taking responsibility of their health, this could potentially change a little bit, or it could keep getting worse. And the fresh stuff the fruits will start going down more. They sort of plateaued and stayed stable for a little bit. Hopefully the oils and the fats will go down. the added sweeteners and the sugars will go down, so will the refined things. But obviously they're going up. From 1970 to 2010, 600 calories more a day. That's a lot, you know. And it's also an interesting thing. I'm kind of all over the map here, but hopefully you find this interesting. An interesting look at the idea of how calories in do not equal calories out, which is a whole big topic. And it shows that calorie counting is a real myth, and you really, formulas and calculations and how many to take and how many to burn off or how much your body needs or how much is burning off is really, like I said, a complete myth. Because if you look at the difference in the calories, so say, okay, I don't know, say whatever age you are, you're 20 or whatever, 1970, and you're eating 2,000 calories a day. On average, at this point, you're eating 600 more a day. And at kind of the halfway point, you're eating 400 a day, extra calories a day. Now, if you're to add this up, let's even be conservative and say every day you've been eating an extra 350 calories, which is just about half of what we're probably intaking. So if you're eating 350 extra calories a day over the course of a year, I've got my calculator right here, is 127,000 extra calories each year. Now, if you're looking at the amount of calories it takes to make a pound of fat, it's 3,500. So if you divide the amount of calories you would have been overconsuming, or this hypothetical person would be overconsuming over the course of a year, that's going to be 36 pounds of fat added every year. And this is over the course of 3 decades. So if you times that by 30, that's over 1,000 pounds. So the question is, obviously there's an obesity problem, but it's not just why is there an obesity problem? Is why are we not actually all horrifically the size of a small hatchback? And this is one of those examples of why that calories in does not equal calories out. And I really recommend not being a slave to counting calories and doing stuff like that. Your body, even though, obviously weight gain is inevitable and stuff like that, your body is able to manage quite a lot. It doesn't mean this is good for it, but just that whole idea of the calorie math, your body's not a calculator. It's a biological organism, and it will adjust and it will adapt. There will be conditions that come with it, but it's just anyone who's just trying to shove that idea of calories down your throat. I'll link up an episode. Probably the best guy to talk about this is a guy named Jonathan Baylor, and he has a book called The Calorie Myth, and I had him on my show a while back. And New York Times bestseller. Like this book's awesome. It's probably one of the best on this whole issue and talking about this whole myth of calories and about getting back to eating real whole foods and how your body adjusts to that and you don't have to worry and the whole deal. So I'll link that episode up because he's awesome at explaining this whole thing with a lot of good research and everything too. But it's just an interesting progression from the 70s to, current times, a few years back with this data I'm looking at, and how much more we're consuming of those things we don't need, how much our calorie intake has gone up, and it's starting to taper off as far as the fresh stuff and the fiber and the fruits and the vegetables and whatever. And, as of the last few years, we're looking at, 2/3 of, again, this is more based on American studies, but North American kind of stats sort of equal out depending at various points of where you are in, say, Canada or the US. 2/3 of us are currently overweight and 1/3 are obese. And it comes back to this moderation thing. And we didn't get this way by consuming all things in moderation. We got this way by consuming many things and many of the wrong things in huge excess. Our calorie intake, it's gone up by more than 30%, and it's coming from all those things, the refined sugars and carbs and everything like that. So that's why, it's kind of this tough love situation. And again, I include myself in this, but all this idea of all foods fit and everything like that, and I think these things have been taken out of context, saying, just go for it, go whatever. It's, the original sayings were not like all foods fit, but all foods can fit into a healthy diet if, big if, consumed in moderation with appropriate portion size and combined with regular physical activities. Like, this is assuming that the cornerstone of your diet is real, fresh, whole foods and you're eating as clean as possible. Then maybe they can fit only with the right size. And again, the activity issue being a big thing with people being less and less active. We can see that we're not consuming foods in moderation and we're not regularly active. As stat wise, 70% of us do not even meet the minimum recommendations for activity exercise. It's why the current concept of everything in moderation for the average person is a complete myth. It just doesn't work. Ideally you're getting at least 20 minutes of exercise, 5 days a week. The sweet spot, if you're new to exercise and want to get fit and healthy and everything, is around 150 minutes a week. And that can be broken up a few different ways. It can be, you can do an hour and then do that over a couple times, or you can do every day for 20 minutes or 25 or 30 minutes. Somehow over the course of the week, you want to hit that 150 minute mark by at least 3 days of exercise a week. Ideally, you're doing something every day, whether it's even just going for a walk or whatever. So when I'm talking about moderation today, it's our approach to moderation is just completely off because we're not doing those things that are sort of the bedrock of health, eating the real foods, exercising regularly and stuff like that. So our moderation is sort of caught up with us. We're just so far from what constitutes being healthy that there's a lot of work to do to get back where we could once again discuss moderation, but it's just got to be the avoidance of these things that have just caused such detriment, and rationalizing the overconsumption of harmful foods or the minimal consumption of beneficial foods with a saying that does not apply to the situation a lot of people find themselves in is really not helping anyone. So that's the problem I got when I see people sprouting off, everything in moderation, don't worry, go. I don't know if they've been looking at the whole big picture and helping people understand that no, you might have to do a reset here before you allow these things to sort of be a continued staple in your diet that are causing, the issues of getting to that point where you're like, okay, I've been eating this way for 20 years and now there's some problems. There's no, they always say the best time to start getting healthy was yesterday. And then if that's not an option, it's today's the next best option. So you can always get on top of it. And it starts with, at least double your intake of fruits, vegetables, the fiber, start to get to those minimum recommendations. In addition to that, try to cut or drastically reduce the amount of sugars you have. One of the big tips is just stop drinking any form of calories, because that's usually the way we take in a ton of sugar, and it's very easy to do it. So cutting out soft drinks, juices, milk, sports drinks, whatever, stuff like that. Cutting back on the sodium. At least get these things, like, at least you don't have to, like, I know how tough it is just to cut something off like cold turkey. At least cut them in half, have them and sort of transition away from them. The more you think about the moderation and continuing to do what you're doing, it's not going to help accomplish this. It's, backing off on those things. The secret is start adding in fresh, real stuff, and eventually it pushes that crap to the side, and then there's no more room for it. And like I mentioned earlier, when you sort of reset and refresh your taste buds by adding in more of this stuff, naturally it's pushing those things to the side. And when you do have them again, they're not what you remember. And then you stop really craving them and you start to want that real, fresh, better version of those things. So whether it's, making your own desserts at home and using the freshest ingredients, or replacing flours with, almond flour or coconut flour, stuff like that, and using like dark chocolate instead of some sugary whatever, using cinnamon and, stuff like that. They're just natural versions of these things that you can easily make or find or buy, and then develop the taste for that. And then, when you do have those things, you might find yourself not wanting them. And that's ideal, because now your real craving is for these real, whole, genuine foods. So I don't know, sort of an interesting topic. I think so. Just sort of shifting our way of thinking, getting more of an understanding of our current situation and the solutions to make it better, and how the idea of everything in moderation maybe not the most helpful advice. And that's just kind of what I wanted to look at in this episode. Hopefully you found this interesting. If not, or if you've already tuned out, no problem. I understand. I've got these other episodes, though. Definitely check them out that go more into depth. So go to regainedwellness.com/143. Check out the sugar thing, more about trans fats, and listen to the Jonathan Baylor interview about the calorie myth. And that to me, that's one of the most interesting things in nutrition. So thank you for listening. I know there's a lot of episodes out there that cover all different sort of health topics. So thank you for taking the time to listen to this one. If you really like it, make sure to subscribe wherever you get podcasts. I should be there, like the Jackson 5. And if you really like it, leave a rating and review, and then more people can, get the chance to listen to it too. So that's it for me. Thanks for listening. See you later.